focus for Psychology Ninjas today is properties of reinforcement, and that's in learning theories. This is often referred to as schedules of reinforcement as well. When we're talking about this, it's a theory. So therefore, we're still following that guidance on AO1, which is that we are explaining all of the key terms associated with this theory. This breaks down into our different types of reinforcement, and it's really important that you know the difference between ratio and interval, and fixed and variable. It's also worth noting here that where we have continuous reinforcement, where the reinforcer always follows a behaviour, that is more likely to result in quicker learning than partial or variable. Also, variable makes extinction less likely. So if we use variable reinforcement, we're retaining those behaviours for longer. Variable reinforcement also means that behaviour is displayed more consistently. Equally, we can talk about behaviour modification and shaping here. Behaviour modification is that we're using reinforcement to change behaviour in a very broad sense. We can talk about different types of behaviour modification here, one of which is token economy, where you provide secondary reinforcers to modify behaviour. We can also talk about systematic desensitisation here, or flooding, or aversion therapy. All of these are different ways in which we might use behaviour modification. Shaping is a bit more tricky. This is when the behaviour is quite complex, and so we need to break it down into smaller stages for somebody to manage. If we're thinking about fear here, systematic desensitisation is a really good example of shaping, that participants have an anxiety hierarchy, and that is breaking down that fear into more manageable steps. How do we evaluate? Well, we've already established that this is a theory, and therefore we're following SODA as our platform for evaluation. This breaks it down into supporting research, opposing it, giving a different explanation, and some application. Within each of these, we strongly advise students to have arguments and counter-arguments to develop those logical chains of reasoning. Also within this, our links are our mini conclusions, and we can do this instead of having an overall conclusion. So when we're thinking about this 8 marker, evaluate schedules of reinforcement as an explanation of learning, we know that the command word evaluate is asking us to explain and then give strengths and weaknesses. We also want to have balance between our different assessment objectives. When writing this essay, you want to work along the way, giving some explanation and then some evaluation. So you'd start with a description of continuous and partial reinforcement, and you could use examples to help you here. Then we're saying there's research support for continuous reinforcement, and that comes from Skinner and Skinner's box, because the rats were continually reinforced with the food pellet. Every time they pulled the lever, they got a food pellet. We're going to counter that, because it fails to explain how we initially get those behaviours. It doesn't explain why the rat initially decided to scrabble around the cage and pull that lever. Therefore, when we're talking about schedules of reinforcement, it's more about how we continue to have a behaviour or maintain it. Here we're talking about a lack of external validity in that it's only explaining certain behaviours. We then move on through to talk about fixed ratio and variable ratio reinforcement, again using examples. We're opposing the research this time by saying that it lacks validity. It fails to take into account a range of factors that affect our behaviour and our learning, especially internal motivation, that some things we just do without any reinforcement from anybody else. We're going to counter this here with a key piece of research from Latham and Dossett. They used mountain beaver trappers, and this supported that a variable ratio was more effective than a fixed ratio. Then we're going to move through saying that there's external reliability for this, there are consistency in the findings, and we've now got animal research and human research both saying that schedules of reinforcement are effective. Our next thing is to talk about fixed interval and variable interval, and here we're going for a different theory, that actually peers are significant in learning. Social learning theory is our alternative, and this is a better explanation because vicarious reinforcement is significant in learning. We do not need these schedules of reinforcement to necessarily happen to us. Extending this further, we're then going to talk about motivation being a key factor within our reinforcement, that we have to want those reinforcers in order for it to be effective in our behaviour. Therefore, schedules of reinforcement as an explanation for learning is reductionist. It's too simplistic. Finally, we talk about behaviour modification and shaping, and here we talk about application. Here our application is coming from an example of behaviour modification. We've gone for token economy here, but you're more than welcome to use a different one. This is directive, which means that those in power have control over who gets tokens and what behaviours are reinforced. This is using expert social control and is a good example for this as an issue in debate. Our conclusion here is this is open to abuse, that it depends on who is using behaviour modification to how effective it is and whether it's appropriate. We could talk about here that it would be unethical to use primary reinforcers as part of our behaviour modification and shaping. So let's move through and have a look at some exam questions. Here we've got a STEM question, but it's an explain question. Therefore, all of our discussions of schedules of reinforcement need to be linked into Vlad and his dog. So you don't get any marks here for explaining what those different techniques are. Let's have a look at another exam question. Here we have the command word discuss. This is looking for two different skills. One, explanation of behaviour modification. So telling me what behaviour modification is. Our AO2, our application, is all coming from Kaylee using these behaviour modifications in an inpatient psychiatric facility. So all of our examples would need to be appropriate for that setting. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell.